Judge Halen thought he was sentencing a clueless teen until the defendant started dismantling the case like a seasoned lawyer. The air inside the Los Angeles County Courthouse felt thick, almost suffocating. Rows of spectators filled the gallery, murmuring among themselves as they watched the scene unfold. The defendant's table looked too big for the young man standing beside it, hands in his pockets, chin lifted just enough to show he wasn't afraid. Cade Mercer, 19, accused of grand theft auto and resisting arrest. The charges were serious, but the way Judge Walter Halen looked at him made it clear the real trial had nothing to do with the law. Halen leaned back in his chair, fingers drumming lazily against the polished wood of his desk. He peered down at Cade over the rim of his glasses, his lips twisting into something between a smirk and a sneer. "You think you're some kind of legal expert?" His voice carried a dry amusement. "This isn't a debate club, kid." A few chuckles rippled through the courtroom. The bailiff, the stenographer, even the prosecutor. They were all in on the joke. Cade didn't flinch. He wasn't laughing. He had spent years preparing for this moment. Not this exact one. He never planned on standing here as a defendant, but he knew the courtroom like the back of his hand. While other kids memorized basketball stats, he memorized case law. While his friends played video games, he played mock trials in his head, arguing imaginary cases with himself. His mother, Denise Dawson, had worked as a paralegal for over 22 years, and Cade had grown up listening to the stories she brought home. How prosecutors cut corners, how judges played favorites, how some defense attorneys barely tried. He absorbed everything. By the time he was 15, he could break down a trial better than most law students, but none of that mattered to Halen. To him, Cade was just another kid in trouble. "Let's make this quick," the judge sighed, flipping open the case file. "I have a golf game at 2. The audience chuckled again, but this time something shifted. Cade's lips curled into a faint, almost imperceptible smirk, because Halen had just made his first mistake, but the courtroom hadn't noticed yet. The prosecutor, Mitchell Carrington, rose from his seat with the air of a man who had already won. His suit was crisp, his tie perfectly knotted, and his voice carried that rehearsed confidence of someone who had delivered the same speech 100 times before. "Your Honor, the state will prove beyond a shadow of a doubt that the defendant, Cade Mercer, was caught red-handed in a stolen vehicle. A 2022 Audi A6 reported missing just hours before his arrest. Officers pursued him through downtown, where he allegedly attempted to flee before being apprehended. His fingerprints were found on the steering wheel. The prosecution submits that the evidence speaks for itself." The words landed with weight. The crowd in the gallery shifted, whispering among themselves. On the surface, it sounded damning. A stolen car, a chase, running. Judge Halen glanced at Cade over the rim of his glasses, then turned back to Carrington. "Go on." The prosecutor walked toward the jury box, his polished shoes clicking against the floor. "The defense may try to convince you that this was all a misunderstanding, that Mr. Dawson is some unfortunate victim of circumstance." He turned, locking eyes with Cade for the first time. "But let's be honest. What kind of victim runs from the police?" The tension in the room thickened. Judge Halen leaned forward, resting his chin on his hand. Cade didn't blink. Carrington continued, flipping through a stack of papers. "Your Honor, I have here the testimony of Officer Daniel Ruiz, who personally witnessed the defendant behind the wheel before he attempted to flee. The car was confirmed stolen. The arrest was made by the book." Halen exhaled through his nose, nodding. "Sounds straightforward to me." And for most people in the room, it probably did. The case was clear-cut. A stolen car, a chase, an arrest. But Cade had spent too many years studying trials not to see the cracks. Still, he stayed silent, watching, waiting. Judge Halen tapped his gavel lightly. "All right, let's hear the defense's response." He turned to Cade's lawyer, a public defender named Lisa Thornton, who had barely said 3 words since stepping into the courtroom. She stood up, shifting nervously. "Your Honor." My client Cade placed a hand on her arm, a silent request. She hesitated, then sat back down, and for the first time, Cade spoke. "I'll be representing myself, Your Honor." The room went completely silent. Judge Halen stared at him, clearly amused. "You'll what?" Cade's voice was calm, steady. "I'll be defending myself." A murmur spread through the courtroom. The bailiff's eyebrows shot up, his grip tightening slightly on the baton at his side. A few jurors exchanged glances. Carrington's smirk faltered for just a second before he let out a sharp, almost dismissive laugh. This should be interesting. But no one was laughing when Cade took his first step forward, because everything was about to change. The weight of the courtroom settled around Cade as he adjusted his stance, his hands still in his pockets. He let the silence stretch just a little longer, long enough to make them uncomfortable, long enough for the anticipation to crackle in the air. Then finally he spoke, his voice steady, deliberate. "Your Honor, before I begin, I'd like to confirm something with the prosecution." Carrington raised an eyebrow, crossing his arms, his posture shifting ever so slightly as if already dismissing whatever was coming. "Go ahead." Cade took a slow step forward, his gaze locking onto Carrington's with the kind of confidence that sent a ripple of unease through the room. "You said Officer Daniel Ruiz personally saw me behind the wheel before I was arrested, correct?" Carrington exhaled sharply, already bored, already preparing his counter. "That's right. And that testimony is written in his report?" "Of course it is." Cade nodded as if digesting the information, then turned to Judge Halen. "Your Honor, I move to dismiss that testimony as evidence." Halen squinted at him, adjusting his glasses slightly as he leaned forward. "On what grounds?" Cade pulled his hands from his pockets for the first time, the subtle movement drawing all eyes toward him. He gestured towards the prosecution's table, his expression unreadable, his voice unwavering. "Because Officer Ruiz never saw me in that car. In fact, he wasn't even on duty when the chase began." A flicker of confusion crossed Carrington's face, brief but undeniable. "What are you talking about?" Cade took another step forward, his presence pressing in on the space like a slow-moving storm. "Your Honor, if the court allows me, I'd like to submit a request to verify Officer Ruiz's GPS logs from that night. If his report says he witnessed me in the vehicle, then it should match his location history. But," he let the word hang in the air, a small pause just long enough to draw everyone in, "I have a feeling it won't." Now the murmurs in the gallery grew louder, a current of unease sweeping through the room. A few reporters in the back leaned forward, pens scratching hastily against their notepads. The jury members shifted, exchanging uncertain looks. Even Judge Halen sat back slightly, his fingers tapping against the bench in quiet consideration. Carrington's jaw tightened, his fingers curling into a fist against the table. For the first time since the trial had started, the carefully laid out narrative was slipping through his grasp, and Cade knew it. Halen frowned, glancing toward Carrington. "Counselor?" Carrington cleared his throat, his jaw tightening. "That report was filed by an officer of the law, Your Honor. Are we really going to take the word of a defendant over a trained professional?" Cade gave a small, almost casual shrug. "If the officer was where he claimed to be, then the GPS data will prove it. But if he wasn't," he let the sentence trail off, his voice even, but his eyes sharp. Halen studied him for a long moment, fingers tapping lightly on the bench. Then he turned to Carrington. "Does the prosecution have any issue with verifying the officer's GPS logs?" Carrington hesitated. The pause was just long enough. The jury noticed. The gallery noticed. And most importantly, the judge noticed. Cade took a quiet breath. He had spent years watching trials, studying prosecutors, their tactics, the way they played the system. And there was one thing he knew without a doubt. If Carrington was confident in his case, he wouldn't be stalling. Halen sighed, rubbing his temple. "Counselor?" Carrington finally shook his head. "No objections, Your Honor." But the shift had already begun. For the first time, the courtroom wasn't laughing anymore. The courtroom was silent, but the tension was loud. Carrington shuffled his papers, his polished confidence cracking around the edges. He cleared his throat again, attempting to regain control. "Your Honor, while we wait for the GPS records, the fact remains that the defendant's fingerprints were found on the steering wheel of the stolen vehicle." Cade gave a small nod, his face unreadable. "That's true." He took a step forward, slow and deliberate. "But let's talk about that evidence for a second." Halen raised an eyebrow, gesturing for him to continue. Cade turned to the jury, letting his gaze settle on each one of them. His voice remained steady, measured. "The prosecution wants you to believe that finding my fingerprints in a car means I stole it. That's the story they're selling. But let's think about this logically. He took a deep breath, letting the weight of his words settle. Let's say you walk into a department store and try on a jacket. You put your hands in the pockets, maybe zip it up, then put it back on the rack and walk out. A few hours later, someone shoplifts that jacket. Would the fact that your fingerprints are on it mean you stole it? A few jurors exchanged glances. Someone in the gallery muttered something under their breath. The atmosphere shifted just slightly. Kay didn't give them time to recover. The car in question was parked outside a 7-Eleven hours before the alleged theft. I was inside that store with 3 friends. And yes, when we walked past the car, I leaned against it. I even opened the door because it was already unlocked. I didn't think much of it. Didn't take the car. Didn't drive it. Oh, didn't steal anything from inside, just a dumb moment of curiosity. He let that sit for a second. Then in a voice that cut through the silence like a scalpel, he asked, "Does touching something make you a criminal?" Carrington cleared his throat, flipping through his notes, searching for something, anything, to regain control. But Cade wasn't finished. And while we're on the topic, let's talk about how that fingerprint analysis was done. He turned to Halen. "Your Honor, was the forensic specialist from this case subpoenaed to testify?" Halen blinked, caught off guard by the question. He glanced at Carrington. The prosecutor hesitated, then reluctantly, "No." Cade's lips pressed together. "So let me get this straight. The state is using forensic evidence to try and convict me, but they didn't think it was necessary to bring in the actual specialist who processed that evidence? No chance for me to cross-examine, ask about the chain of custody, or challenge the accuracy of the analysis?" Carrington's jaw tightened. Cade nodded, like that was all he needed to hear. "Interesting," Judge Halen sighed, pinching the bridge of his nose. It was the look of a man realizing this case was not the easy win he had assumed it would be. But Cade wasn't done yet, because the next thing he was about to say, it would change everything. Cade took a slow step forward, his voice steady but firm. "Your Honor, I'd like to enter into evidence an official statement from the owner of the vehicle." Judge Halen frowned. "The owner?" Cade nodded. "Yes, Mr. Raymond Weir, the registered owner of the stolen Audi, provided a statement to the police that, for some reason, was never submitted in the prosecution's filings. And I think I know why." He turned to Carrington. "Do you recall what Mr. Weir told officers the night his car was reported stolen?" Carrington's jaw clenched. He knew exactly what was coming. Cade didn't wait for him to answer. Instead, he pulled out a printed transcript from his file and read aloud. "I left my car running when I ran inside the gas station. Some kid must have jumped in and taken off. But it wasn't the guy you arrested. I saw the kid, and he was white." A collective gasp rippled through the courtroom. Cade held the paper up. "That's from the original police report. The same report the prosecution conveniently never mentioned." He turned back to Judge Halen. "The arresting officer omitted this from his testimony. The prosecution ignored it. And yet, they want this jury to believe that I, someone who doesn't even match the description of the real thief, am guilty beyond a reasonable doubt?" Carrington stepped forward, scrambling. "Your Honor, this is irrelevant. The defendant was caught in possession of the vehicle." But Cade shook his head. "No, I wasn't." His voice didn't rise, but it cut through the courtroom with sharp precision. "I was arrested blocks away from where the vehicle was abandoned, walking home after getting snacks with my friends. I wasn't in the car. I wasn't near the car. I wasn't running from anything. The only thing tying me to this case is bad police work and assumptions." Judge Halen let out a slow breath, rubbing his temple. The case was unraveling fast, and everyone knew it. Cade turned back to the jury. "The real suspect got away that night. The officers found a black kid in the same general area and decided that was close enough. That's what this case is really about." Silence. Halen cleared his throat and adjusted his glasses. "Does the prosecution have anything further?" Carrington was stiff, his face flushed. "No, Your Honor." Judge Halen exhaled. He looked at Cade for a long time, then glanced at the jury. Finally, he leaned forward and spoke the words that would stay with everyone in that room. "Case dismissed." A beat of stunned silence, then chaos. Half the courtroom erupted, some in disbelief, some in quiet relief. The gallery stirred, reporters scribbling in their notebooks. Cade didn't move right away. He let the moment settle. Let the reality sink in for everyone. Judge Halen, still gripping his gavel, looked at Cade with an unreadable expression. There was something in his eyes that hadn't been there before. Recognition. Maybe even regret. Cade met his gaze, then turned to leave. But just as he reached the door, the judge spoke again. "Mr. Dawson." Cade stopped but didn't turn. Halen hesitated, then finally said, "You should consider law school." Cade smirked. He didn't need to consider it. He was already on his way. Outside the courthouse, the air was thick with voices. The energy was electric, a storm of flashing lights and shouted questions. Reporters swarmed the steps, their cameras snapping, microphones thrust forward like weapons. Each one desperate to capture the moment, to be the first with a quote, a reaction, a headline. "Cade, did you know the judge would dismiss the case? What are you going to do next? How does it feel to outmaneuver a seasoned prosecutor?" Cade pulled his hoodie over his head, the fabric shielding him from the relentless barrage. He kept walking, his pace steady, his face unreadable. He wasn't interested in the spectacle. He didn't need the attention, the validation. This wasn't about proving how smart he was. It was about something bigger. At the bottom of the steps, his mother, Denise, was waiting. She stood still, her arms crossed, her posture tight with tension. Her face was unreadable, her expression a careful mask, but her eyes told the truth. Relief, worry, something deeper, something only a mother could feel. For a long moment, she just looked at him. The noise around them faded, the world shrinking to just the two of them. Then finally, she shook her head and let out a breath. "Boy, you scared me half to death." Cade chuckled, a quiet sound, rubbing the back of his head. The weight of the day sat heavy on his shoulders, but in this moment, with her, it eased just a little. "Had to take a risk, Ma." She stared at him a second longer, then closed the distance between them, pulling him into a tight hug. Her arms were warm, solid, grounding. He let himself sink into the embrace just for a second, letting the tension of the courtroom, the trial, the fight, slip away. "You always were the stubborn one." The cameras kept flashing, the reporters kept shouting, but Cade wasn't paying attention to them anymore. The world outside didn't matter. Not now. Across the street, standing by his car, Judge Halen watched. His posture was different now. The arrogance was gone. His expression wasn't amused anymore. It was something else, something closer to reflection. He hadn't expected this case to be anything more than routine. Just another day, another defendant, another guilty plea, a stack of files on his desk, each one a name, a case number, a sentence. It was supposed to be simple. The facts were laid out. The evidence was filed. The outcome was predictable. But now he knew he'd remember this one. Because Cade had done something most people never could. He made the system look at itself. And for once, it blinked first. Judge Halen had seen it all before, defendants who folded under pressure, who took plea deals just to escape the grind of a system designed to break them down. He had seen prosecutors wield their power with confidence, officers testify with unwavering certainty, juries nod along without question. But this was different. Cade hadn't crumbled. He hadn't faltered. He had stood there, unwavering, peeling back the layers of assumption, of bias, of procedure. He had taken control of a courtroom that was never meant to be his. And in doing so, he forced everyone to confront an uncomfortable truth. Justice wasn't just about the law. It was about the people who enforced it, interpreted it, manipulated it. Here's the lesson we should learn. How many other cases had gone this way? How many people had been convicted not because of evidence, but because of bias, shortcuts, in a system that cared more about closing cases than finding the truth? Judge Halen felt the weight of it settle on his shoulders. It wasn't a new thought, but it had never felt this personal. He had signed off on rulings, dismissed motions, upheld convictions, always believing he was serving justice. But was he? How many had slipped through the cracks, too overwhelmed, too underprepared to fight back the way Cade had? Cade had the knowledge to fight back. But what about the ones who didn't? This wasn't just about one case. It was about all of them. Cade knew what he had to do next. The fire had been lit, and there was no extinguishing it now. This courtroom wouldn't be the last one he stood in, but next time he wouldn't be the defendant, he'd be the attorney. And when that day came, he wouldn't be the only one. Because this wasn't just his fight. It belonged to everyone who had ever been silenced, dismissed, railroaded by a system that had forgotten its purpose. He had walked into that courtroom accused, but he was walking out with something far more powerful: conviction. Not the kind that came from a gavel hitting wood, but the kind that fueled change. If this story made you think, even for a second, then share it. The justice system is built on laws, but it's run by people, and people can change, but only if we make them. Hit that like button, subscribe for more stories that matter, and let's keep the conversation going. Because next time, it might not be Cade, it might be someone you know.